Hey there, welcome to the hashtag I'm My Everywhere show. Thank you, Matthew Neill, for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here.
Glad to be talking and evangelizing on the IBMI platform and being able to encourage all great benefits of this system. Now, back in the day, we called hashtag pound signs.
Things have changed over the couple of years. Are there any topics that we wanted to talk about, like giving back to the community or talking about a variety of different things that we missed on our previous conversation?
Yeah, so there's a couple good topics there. One on giving back to the IBMI community. And it is a community. It is a particular platform. It's an interesting domain to work in. And it's one that I still see is very relevant in the business environment, especially. And so I'm going to be going to Common. I'm looking forward to that. The company I'm working for is sending me and probably 7 or 8 other folks there. One of the aspects of going to Common, especially when you work for a larger enterprise, is going with a mindset of train the trainer. And we're always going there to learn. I'm hoping to do some kind of like lunch and learn sessions with some of the folks that I'm going to be interacting with back home. And so I'm trying to learn new approaches, some of the latest techniques on the IBMI, and get them internalized in such a way that I can share those with the staff that I'm going to be engaging with. So I think that aspect of being able of continually learning, I believe that's one of the cores of modernization, is learning new ways of doing things and being an advocate for the value of those approaches.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point you're making, is that when we talk about modernization, but also when we talk about purpose and goals of going to an event, I think a lot of times we go to events and people don't have an intention, or they're not intentional about what they're intending to do and trying to get out. And it's really I'm glad to hear that you are coming in with a specific goal in mind and multiple goals. And they're kind of smart goals, which are they're goals that are able to be attainable, they're timely, and it's exciting that you're doing that. And when we talk a little bit about one of the reasons why I reached out to you originally is because I knew you're kind of like an IBMI evangelist. Maybe you want to share a little bit about why you view yourself as an IBMI evangelist.
Sure. I mean, a lot of people on a lot of the newer systems think that, oh, it's an old system, not using up-to-date technologies. And just because there's a particular syntax in coding that RPG favors for us, when we move that aside and recognize that through services, through modular development, through approaches that are modern, we can connect and expand the universe of this platform in really exciting ways. So that's why I've always been an evangelist on this platform.
I find it very intriguing that the reason that you're excited about it is because the ability to interact and be able to integrate with the latest and greatest and of everywhere, but it's still able to utilize the very code that you've built, as you mentioned, from 1972. I think that that's a really interesting point. And is that when you think about the next generation of IBMIers, what do you suggest to them? You had a mentee that you could talk to today and say, hey, this is what you should be focusing on. What would you tell them?
I just was getting to interact with a project manager coming new to the platform, and she said, there's a lot of heritage in the IBMI platform. Sometimes we call it legacy. Sometimes that comes out as a pejorative, that it's the legacy system. But I look at it as a long heritage of solving business problems with some great application developer mindsets over many, many years. And so I guess one of the things is, don't throw out the old people or the legacy people with the bathwater. It's no longer the babies with the bathwaters, it's us older folks. There's a lot to be learned in interacting with newer developers and people who have been more seasoned on this platform. I'm learning constantly from people who are PHP developers in the organization I work in. I have a long heritage of SQL, and I'm able to impart ways of interacting with the platform from an SQL perspective from developers who have been more seasoned RPG developers. And so I think one of the greatest things in this domain on the IBMI platform is collaboration. I don't think there's as much as a top-down hierarchy as there is a mindset of us being able to collaborate effectively with one another, regardless of our pedigree on this platform. And I think I feel like I'm in the fourth quarter, just beginning the fourth quarter of my career history. And I feel like I got another 7, 8, 9 years left of being able to really enjoy being able to evangelize, teach, and learn all at the same time. And I think that's when newer folks to the platform come in with that mindset and are able to really recognize that there is that deep pedigree there, that deep history and heritage there. Bring in the new approaches, bring in the new mindset, and integrate, collaborate well. And I think there's still a long ways to go on the platform.
Being with a lot of older folks or being involved with the IBMI space for a long time, I speak to people that are kind of rooted in their ways. And what would you tell people or guide people when you're talking to people that are kind of rooted in their ways and being able to teach them to open their mindset and being able to get them to go beyond the four walls that they're used to painting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say embrace becoming 7.6 of oneself. IBMI has just announced 7.6 release of the operating system. Every iteration and every tech refresh is new information, new approaches, new code, new ways of doing things. It was interesting. I'd worked for another company for a lot of years, and one of the evangelistic points I always pushed to them was of their particular application. They aren't on version 2. They're still on 1.976 of the same old way of doing things. And I kept pressing, Microsoft had this mindset. They had Windows and Windows NT and Windows 3.1 and all of these other versions that really were in abandonment and a whole new way of doing things that kind of jumped forward. Now, the IBMI has done that. They've made huge shifts under the covers, but they had business in mind to be able to keep things working. And I think just as our platform does that, makes new releases, we need to do that ourselves. Evaluate where do I need an improvement? How can I get a dot release out of my thinking and my ways of approaching problems? How can I get a whole new version out of my ways? And continuing to embrace that kind of a mindset, I think, is one thing that makes IT professionals professional and able to succeed in this ever-changing environment.
A question for you is that I'm going to go back to stories.
Now, one interesting story that I will bring up, I can recall one of my responsibilities in the previous company was to approve every SQL statement that got executed on this very, very large database. One of the aspects of that is sometimes business will come in and have a change requirement where to be nimble, they have to change data without having an application program in place to do it. I had been presented with a requirement and said, hey, we've got 1,800 rows in this huge table that we need to get changed because it's impacting business. There was a bug that got introduced. We've rolled back the code, but the change data is already there. We need to get this corrected. And you think 1,800 rows, it's going to be able to be done pretty quickly. But if we're causing an access plan from an SQL perspective to have to read every row in the table to find those rows, that's hours and hours and hours or days at times to process. I had used a technique. I used a technique called a dynamic compound statement, something IBM introduced a while back, to where you can dynamically, just by tagging it with a begin and an end, and then put your information in the body of that. So I looked at this problem. We've got 1,800 rows. need to be updated into this table. I can find them if I were interacting with an individual partition. I can find every one of those rows, identify the rows ahead of time, know the relative record number of the rows that need to be updated, and be able to control that within the scope of this dynamic compound statement. And I can iterate through one partition at a time, update its rows by relative record number, and go to the next one and code that in such a way to accomplish this business requirement. I tested it in the development environment, had it executing, and it was completing in a matter of seconds, all 1,800 rows in a 20 billion row table. I've shared this approach with the likes of like Scott Forsty, and he's like, hey, that's a great idea for that problem in the scope that you're dealing with these billion row tables. That's a great idea. And had this prepared and spoke to the leadership and showed how to do this, but couldn't connect. There was too much of a fear base that SQL was going to bring down the system in this environment. So instead, the leadership had 6 programmers using DBU for 4 hours to manually hunt and peck and find a row and make an update, and find a row and make an update. And I see that as a failure in leadership, to not being able to speak the same language as their database engineers and understand the problem domain that they're on. And it's an imperative. I think I mentioned last time that good leaders know not only what to do, but they know how to do it. And that's
Matthew,
a
I
challenge.
think the coolest thing about this conversation is your thought process. That the way you broke down the challenge you had, which is we're talking about a magnitude of 1 billion. And messing this up because it's so
It's okay.
unfathomable how big it is.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were able to figure out something using a method that you're applying old knowledge to new problems is so unique. And I'm going to ask another question about your ability to taking something that complicated, and how did you break it down to be able to at least elucidate what a potential answer to that question would be?
I think a lot of really good developers have long memories, deep memories that go back into remembering successes and failures, how they applied and what approach that they utilized. Like to this particular approach, I can remember having a failure point where I tried to do an update on a billion row table and thought I had it tuned in right in the development in the environments, but yet still found it doing a table scan in the production environment. And so that was the failure point. Got the slap on the hand. Don't do that again. And I said, oh, the problem still has to be solvable. There's got to be ways. And so when I looked at this particular scenario and said, a single partition table, and I knew the relative record numbers that were going to be static that I needed to update, I could do it quickly. I had been using that approach on billion row tables, but not 20 billion row tables. The challenge I had was you can't reference a numeric relative record number in a list of partition tables because each partition reuses that relative record number. The thinking process to solve that was, well, if I can iterate through one partition of time and know what its relative record numbers, now I can solve this more complicated problem, being able to build a dynamic program from an SQL statement and execute it. It creates the copy of the program in Qtemp and runs the program based on the SQL statement. And so I said, now I have a solution that I can bring forward.
So, Matthew, I think this is one more question for you. I keep on making it more hard for you. I apologize. But another question is that when if you're going to teach someone how to think like this, to solving really, really challenging issues that are business relevant, that are they potentially could change or disaster, it could be really disastrous if you mess it up. How would you teach someone problem solving at this scale or even at a lower scale?
So, we always have that term KISS, keep it simple, stupid. That's an old one from back in the days. Solutions should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And sometimes we forget that we are working on a computer system and that there are many depths to that computer system. And when we solve something too simply without understanding some of the depths and some of the impact to it. So I'm kind of looking at this from a bigger picture. And so it's tuning your degree of simplicity for the problem. Sometimes problems need to be solved quickly, and you come to the simplest answer, and that's going to work for you. Sometimes problems can have a depth that certain staff within organizations need to be able to dig down a little deeper, come up with more creative solutioning for problems. And I think having an organization that has a mix of those folks that are able to get work done quick, which is important, and folks that are able to get work done deep, and having the mix of that within an organization, I think really helps. And your question is, how do we teach that kind of a mindset? Mentoring. I'm still getting to work with development teams, and sometimes I'll show them a technique and we'll go into the depth of it, and they'll say, "Oh, that's genius. I've experienced this before, and I want to share this and show this to you." And I think when teams are able to work collectively and you have folks that have a mindset that have done things before and have new ways of doing it and want to share that with others, that just makes for a great team. Everybody I've been working with in the last 6 months at the company I'm at now are very excited to learn and be involved. And that really makes for a great learning, mentoring, teaching, learning environment. So I'm still learning every day.
That's awesome. What would you tell that's looking at getting into IBMI or RPG? What would you tell them?
I'm going to answer that from the perspective of organizations that are looking to get out of the IBMI and get out of RPG. Organizations have been doing that as long as I've been in IT. So your question is, how do you get people interested in this? And I think it comes to communicating with the leadership of organizations to really challenge that question. Why? Why would we want to leave this platform? Why would we want to leave RPG? And sometimes it can just be from a perspective of, well, that language may be a little archaic. There may be not enough developers to be able to work with it. And that there can be some truth to that. I'm coming from my vantage point. Sometimes it's from the bottom looking up. I don't see the platform leaving. And I've had 30 years of people saying, we got to leave the platform. And I've seen organizations spend a lot of money and a lot of investment to try and replicate where they've been successful, when organizations may benefit from, how do we improve what we're doing now in modern ways? How do we connect this into different development, different programming languages? How do we do unit testing, automated unit testing on the platform? How do we document our code better? Those are things other platforms have been able to leapfrog above us and get some better approaches. But we can grab that back and bring those approaches and have new people coming up with new open source solutions.
Wow, I love that. I think the most important thing you said was you said at the beginning of the statement, which was why.
Yeah.
Is asking that question is why? Why are we looking to move off? Why? And being able to ask that question, and then also will help when you're trying to think about it, when you're looking at getting into the platform, it makes sense to think about why. Why would I want to do that? And the reason for that is because it is modern and you're able to have job security.